everyone, and welcome to our weekly lecture video. This week we have a lot of topics to cover, and I have to apologize in advance because for this week we cover quite a few topics, and because of that, each one is sort of compressed into just a little bit of discussion around each one. So we don't really go into a lot of detail around each of these topics, not the amount of detail that I would like to go into, but nevertheless, we're going to cover them. So for this week, we're going to talk about several issues, several areas. We're going to talk about religion, alienage, globalization, gender, and sexual orientation. And we're going to go in that order. And again, we have a lot to cover, so we can't spend a whole lot of time on each one. You know, we have entire academic programs designed around these kinds of things. We have entire classes that you could spend 15 weeks really looking into in-depth detail on gender, for example, gender studies, things like that. So we just don't have the time to go into that much detail in this class, but we will sort of touch on the surface of these issues and kind of bring to light some ideas and issues for each one. So let's get started. The first one we'll talk about is religion. And as you've noticed in these videos, I like to quote the EEOC because what they do is they provide a lot of guidance around workplace discrimination, workplace lawsuits, those kinds of things. So I like to bring that up because they're a great resource for us. So according to the EEOC, religious discrimination involves treating a person, in this case an applicant or an employee, unfavorably because of his or her religious beliefs. The law protects not only people who belong to traditional organized religions such as Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism, but also others who have sincerely held religious, ethical, or moral beliefs. So again, not only those who are part of these more established religions, but others as well. So it's a little bit more inclusive than just the most common religions that we have. I want to share with you some statistics around religion, particularly around Muslims around the world and in this country. And I'm going to share with you some numbers that may or may not surprise you regarding people's attitudes towards Muslims. And the reason I point out Islam in particular is because in this country, in the United States, Islam is one of the most controversial kinds of religions that we can talk about. It's not controversial from its sort of roots, its the way it is played out, things like that, but there's a lot of stigma in this country around the religion of Islam. You see presidential candidates talking about it. You see Islam in the news, all kinds of things around particularly this religion. Okay, so let me show you some numbers that relate particularly to the Muslim tradition. This data is was gathered by the Gallup organization, and they asked this question. It's a pretty simple question. They said, if we gave you a list of people, we want to know which of these people you would not like to be your neighbor, okay? So they gave several examples. They started off with drug addicts, and as you can imagine, most people did not want to be the neighbor of a drug addict. So what you have here, you have a chart that depicts people who were French, people who were German, and people who were British, people who were from the UK, how each of them answered in order, okay? So by and large, the overwhelming majority of people, both French, German, and British, they don't want to live next to a drug addict, okay? The next category of people was homosexuals. So kind of interesting that people also didn't want to live next to homosexuals. And below that, third in the list, are Muslims. So what we see is this sort of implicit discrimination, or not even really implicit, this explicit discrimination against folks who identify as Muslims. And this is largely due to unfounded beliefs about the Islamic tradition, about Muslim people who practice the Muslim religion. But it's shocking nonetheless. It is an example of the kinds of discrimination that these kinds of people face, not only in their workplaces, but also in the places they live and play and raise their families. Let's look at another example. So another question posed, and this was a study, a large study, and there's lots of questions involved. I just pulled out two. Have you personally experienced racial or religious discrimination in the past year? And now this is from an American perspective. you'll see that number one, the overwhelming majority, overwhelming response is that Muslims, almost half of Muslims reported experiencing religious discrimination. And so, we have this issue of these folks experiencing this kind of discrimination, not only at work, but also in their personal and social lives. So it's a pretty big issue. Now, the other thing that I want to bring up, according to this chart, is that the lowest amount of discrimination here, so 18% of Protestants at the very far right end of the chart, 18% of Protestants also reported experiencing some kind of racial or religious discrimination over the past year. Now, to me, that indicates that that's still a bad thing, right? Almost 20%, almost a fifth of Protestants are saying, and by far the most numerous religion in this country anyway, the United States, but they're still experiencing, a fifth of them are still experiencing some type of discrimination in this country. Now, again, the number is lower, obviously, but it's really still quite surprising that even a fifth of them receive some kind of discrimination based on their religion. So what I want to ask you is, what kinds of religious discrimination have you seen? And let's talk through some examples. Have you seen Christmas or other religious events celebrated in a workplace? Have you ever seen inflexible work schedules? Sometimes where work is required in a certain day or a certain time, but that doesn't accommodate a schedule. We also can talk about religious inclusion. So in terms of religious inclusion, we can think about things like floating holidays, religious leave time, or even organizational chaplains, a sort of popular kind of tool to use in an organization. Modern organization is this idea of an organizational chaplain, someone of chaplains of many different faiths who are available to speak with employees or to counsel them from a religious perspective. I want to give you an example from the EEOC, and this is an example of a real court case. Actually, it's a real EEOC case, not a court case, an EEOC case that was brought before them, and I just want to give you kind of the rundown, the bullet points of that. So Magnetics International was sued by the EEOC. There was an employee who had notified the organization before he was hired. That's an important point. Before he was hired, that he would be unable to work consecutive Sundays because of religious services. However, the employee was scheduled anyway and was forced to decide between his church and his job. So what do you think happened? Well, ultimately the case was settled out of court with damages being paid to the employee. So this was decided as a case of religious discrimination. Okay, again, just one example for you of this kind of discrimination. I want to turn now quickly to alienage. So what's the difference between alienage and national origin? So let me tell you what the courts say about this. The court, and this is a quote from some cases, the court cited an old Supreme Court case which held that the term national origin was limited to the country from which you or your forebears came. Therefore, held the appeals court, national origin discrimination as defined in Title VII encompasses discrimination based on one's ancestry, but not discrimination based on citizenship or immigration status. So essentially what this was, this is a case that was brought before the Supreme Court, and they were arguing alienage versus national origin. And basically the court said, yes, there is a difference here. There is a different kind of discrimination, and we define alienage and national origin as two different and separate things. And basically, like they say here, national origin is the country from which you or your forebears came. So, for example, my national origin is, I would call it German, right? Because my family comes from Germany. So that's my national origin. My alienage, though, is something separate. My immigration or citizenship status is something separate. I'm a U.S. citizen. So my alienage is U.S. citizen, but my national origin is German. So that's how you can think about the differences. Now, sometimes those two things, they coincide, right? You can be an immigrant, you could come directly from the country, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes those things coincide, sometimes they don't. But they are two separate things according to the courts. Now, connected to this is this issue of globalization. I want to touch on this briefly and talk about issues of globalization. In each of our workplaces, we're facing globalization at a more rapid pace every single day. And I want to bring up to you what's known as Hofstede's cultural dimensions framework. What this does is it attempts to measure cultural values in nations and attempts to say, look, here's how nations on average differ from each other. So what Hofstede did is he identified 5 dimensions of difference between different countries. He attempted to quantify that. Now it has its limitations, obviously, but I'm going to give you an example of the difference between China and the United States on Hofstede's 5 dimensions, on his 5 frameworks, his cultural frameworks, okay? So hopefully you'll be able to see kind of how this plays out. So the first one is power distance. On one hand, we have small power distance, and on the other hand, we have large power distance. Power distance refers to the sort of social distance between you and an employer, so you and your boss. Is there a small distance between that? Can you sort of socially interact with them? Or is there a large power distance? Do you sort of hold them in high regard, high esteem? Do you sort of, they're above you and they're sort of untouchable in a sense? So the United States falls on small power distance side, and China falls at large power distance. So again, how these two countries differ. Another key component of this is individualism. So we have individualism versus collectivism. In the United States, typically, probably no surprise to you, we're typically more individualistic. So we might not be as loyal to an organization. We might need to say, look, I can get a better salary here at this other organization, so I'm going to quit. In the Chinese culture, on the other hand, they're more collectivist. Okay, so we have 2 different ways of viewing things. Now imagine if you had a team or a group of people made up of Americans and made up of Chinese nationals. How do you think that team would work? How do you think the values of that team would sort of come to the surface? Let's take a look at the third part of this framework. You have masculinity versus femininity. Now what this refers to is sort of this issue of aggression being more masculine, of taking charge being more masculine. And Hofstede describes femininity as being more caring, as being more nurturing, those kinds of things. So you may or may not agree with that. I tend to not agree with that, but for argument's sake, this is Hofstede's framework. And he describes each culture in a national sort of setting as being either typically more masculine or more feminine. So let me give you an example. The United States is typically more masculine. Okay, so we're more take charge, more aggressive, those kinds of things. I don't know if you find this surprising or not, but the Chinese culture is also more masculine. So there are more cultures, for example, the Nordic cultures, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, that tend to be more feminine. So things like how this plays out in the workplace is that you have greater leave time for new parents, both father and mother. That's sort of a more nurturing, kind of family-oriented sort of outlook, okay? So that's one example. Let's take a look at another one of Hofstede's cultural frameworks, and that's uncertainty avoidance. Weak uncertainty avoidance versus strong uncertainty avoidance. So do we try to avoid uncertainty? Do we try at all costs to avoid uncertainty, or are we okay with ambiguity? In the United States, Hofstede says we typically have a weak uncertainty avoidance, okay? So we're sort of okay with ambiguity. We're sort of okay with not knowing all of the answers. He also says that the Chinese culture is similar. And lastly, there's a long-term orientation versus a short-term orientation. Excuse me. And he says, in this case, the Chinese culture, they have more of a long-term orientation. They think of long-term goals. They think of things in perhaps decades or hundreds of years rather than 1 year, 5 year, or even months. Whereas in the United States, we have more of a short-term orientation. Now, in closing, thinking about Hofstede's framework, there is one other dimension that he did not include in his his original framework, and that is this issue of indulgence versus restraint. So because it's kind of a new concept, we're not really sure where each individual culture would fall on that, but I would encourage you to think about where we might fall as a culture. Do we fall more on the indulgence side of things or more on the restraint side of things? Maybe it depends. Maybe it depends on the situation or the individual. Now we turn our attention to gender and sex. And I'm going to show you some numbers here that sort of coincide with this as well. There's a TED Talk on gender identity that I want you to take a look at in Blackboard. And it talks about some really interesting scientific grounding around what exactly gender is. and how we identify and how these lines are drawn. She has some really good things to say about the science behind gender, so I want you to take a look at that and think about what it means to differentiate between gender and sex. Typically, when we talk about the difference between sex and gender, we say that sex is normally assigned at birth, and gender is socially constructed. So think about these kinds of things. The clothes that we wear, the colors that we like, the places we go, the food that we eat, the way we look at our own bodies, right? Those are all associated with gender, right? So we would say, for example, well, girls like pink and boys like blue. There's a lot of science to say that actually that's very socially constructed, right? That's not a natural kind of thing, that we associate it with gender, but we associate it from a social perspective, right? We encourage our children through the toys that we buy, through the shows that they watch, those kinds of things. So those kinds of ideas around gender, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, those are socially constructed. Sex, on the other hand, is sort of more of the biological sense behind that, okay? We also think about things like pay equity and the glass ceiling. You've probably heard of issues around both of these things. Let me show you some statistics relating to both of these. So this is a chart depicting earnings of men versus women, and the ratio, the wage gap, in other words. So this goes all the way back to 1955, and unfortunately it only goes to 2010. So we don't have the latest data available in this chart. But what you'll see is a comparison of two things. You have weekly earnings and you have annual earnings. And what it shows you is women's earnings as a percentage of men's earnings. So you'll see that in the 50s and 60s, we started really, really low, 60% or so of women's earnings versus men's. So for every dollar that a man earned, a woman would only earn 60 cents. That's another way to think of it. Now, fast forward to 2010, we're still not where we need to be, right? We're still only up to about 80%. So even current statistics will only tell you between 70 and 80%, maybe a little bit upwards of 80% of earnings, of women's earnings, match men's. And this is for the same kind of work, okay? So really, really kind of interesting things to look at here. Some more information for you. Just comparing earnings again, but also according to race. So what's interesting about this, you'll see obviously that females on average don't earn as much as men, certainly don't earn as much as white men. So it's kind of an interesting comparison. But then when you break it down by race, look for example at Hispanic or Latino. Hispanic or Latino women earn about 60% of what a white male would earn for a similar kind of work. So this is rewinding all the way back to the 1950s and 60s. So in some cases we've kind of gone backwards, right? We still haven't made progress in all the ways that we need to make progress. Interesting note here too is that Asian American females make about 91%, 92% of what a white male would earn. So the highest of the racial breakdown. So I thought that's kind of some interesting data to share with you and to sort of think about. Okay, we now turn to lastly to talk about sexual orientation. And again, we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about this, not as much time as I would like to. I'd like you to read the article on straight privilege, which is included in Blackboard, and think about the ways in which your heterosexuality or one's heterosexuality is privileged in the workplace. The things that you can talk about, the things that you can display, right? Pictures of your family. You can talk about taking a wife or a husband to an event or things like that. So think about those kinds of things as well. You probably have heard about the alphabet soup of sexual orientation. Typically we refer to that as the LGBT movement. Sometimes we throw in other letters, QIA. There's many, many more that we can throw in there. It's a kind of an inclusive sort of thing to do that. LGBT, obviously, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. QIA, questioning, intersexed, asexual. So lots of different ways to think about the ways in which we identify both our gender and our sexual orientation. Now, there's a difference, obviously, between sexual orientation and gender identity. And some people have different gender identities than they do the sex assigned at birth, right? That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their sexual orientation. So your sexual orientation is sort of who you're attracted to. You may be attracted to the same sex, maybe the opposite sex. It could be both sexes. It could be none. So, we have that we set that aside, and we also talk about gender identity. People can identify more masculine. They can identify more feminine. They can identify as queer or none of the above, right? So we have all kinds of different shades of how people can identify and their preferences and their identities here. So don't lump those two together. So sexual orientation and gender identity are two separate things. So don't make the mistake of lumping those together and using those interchangeably. They are different. Okay. That's a lot to pack into a lecture, so thanks for hanging in there with me. I appreciate your listening to the lecture, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Have a great week.